Good morning. This is the third week of our message series that we call When God Doesn't Make Sense. God doesn't always make sense. So far, we've looked at why God says no to seemingly good things in life, oftentimes because they're not so good for us after all. Last week, we looked at why God allows people to suffer and die. A difficult topic, but one that can lead us into a deeper understanding of Christ's cross. Today, we want to look at the times God seems uncooperative. Maybe there's an obstacle in your professional life, or a systems issue, or a personal problem at home, and it seems as if God has intentionally placed roadblocks to make your life difficult. Today we're going to look at the book of Exodus that we heard as our first reading, which tells the story of the Israelites' escape from slavery in Egypt. God sees the suffering of his people and sends Moses to challenge the Egyptian Pharaoh to let his people go. You know the story. The Pharaoh refuses, God sends plagues, and the Pharaoh relents. The Israelites leave Egypt, but then the Pharaoh changes his mind and he sends his army after them. At the dramatic climax of the story, the Israelites are trapped between the Red Sea in front of them and the approaching Egyptian army in pursuit. The people are terrified, and then Moses prays urgently and God parts the sea. That's where we pick up the story today. Basically, after all of that, they ran out of water and they blamed it on Moses. You know that feeling. You have an expectation and it isn't met. And in that moment, it's very difficult to take the disappointment graciously. So the people find fault with Moses. They blame him for their lack of water. I get it, and I hope you do too, because we all do that every day. But the language here and in a few other verses suggests a deeper issue, an issue of the heart. The people thirsted there for water, and they murmured against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst?" Murmuring is an expression of ingratitude. And it seems natural enough, which it is, and harmless enough, which it's not. Murmuring is actually habit-forming, and it can easily become self-defeating if it becomes our default response to any situation. Have you ever met people like that? They murmur and complain about everything, and it makes them very unattractive. But they can't help it. It's become their habitual response to nearly anything that happens. So Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They're almost ready to stone me." Notice the big difference here. The people complain against God, and Moses complains to God and asks for his direction. That's the key to understanding this whole passage. The people complain against God, and Moses complains to God, asking for his direction. And the Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand your rod. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it." God told Moses to leave the camp because by their lack of faith, the people had forfeited the right to see God's work. He shrewdly brought along some of the elders so that they could verify what happened. So Moses followed his instructions, and, no surprise, water came from the rock. And Moses named the place Massah and Meribah. Massah meaning testing, because the people were testing God, and Meribah meaning problems or strife. This was a place where a problem was encountered. They didn't have access to water. And in the midst of their problem, God was testing them. And far from passing that test, that generation of Israelites never got to enter the promised land. They never got to where God wanted them to be. A journey that should have taken 11 days winds up taking 40 years because they tested God and didn't trust God. There are certainly some toxic situations you should remove yourself from, some battles you can't win, some relationships that are abusive, some projects that are ultimately useless. But be careful of fleeing a situation just because it's difficult. Nothing worth accomplishing is ever easy. And maybe that's not just bad luck, that's on purpose, because those obstacles force us to lean into God. And if we're willing to lean into God and depend upon His grace, we will see His power just like Moses did. God's main concern isn't always your level of comfort. That's usually our goal, but not God's. God wants to build our character, because our character is one of the only things we get to take to heaven with us. The Lord tests those He loves.